very pleased to be introducing our next speaker, Daniel Hoffman-Schwartz. Daniel's research focuses on how literature interacts with philosophy and politics. He holds a PhD in comparative literature from NYU and is now based here at Princeton as a lecturer in the Department of Comparative Literature. Daniel is co-editor of the volume Flirtations, Rhetoric and Aesthetics, This Side of Seduction, or Boredom. He's also editor of the forthcoming volume, Handsomely Done, Aesthetics, Politics, and Media After Melville, coming out with Northwestern. He's currently completing his first monograph, titled Infinite Reflection on the Revolution in France, Burke, Romanticism, Translation. And without further ado, the new title of his talk today, Philosophical and/or Poetic Nationalism Towards the Foreign. Please welcome Daniel Hoffman-Schwartz.
Okay, thanks. I want to end by thanking Katie and Rodrigo for the invitation. It's really an honor to be included at a conference with so many people who've done so much for thinking and scholarship in these traditions. We were talking last night, some of us, about the unusual structure of the conference where we're all responding to the same text, the anxiety of getting scooped, that someone will say what you've said before you've said it. I'm only second, so you would think I'm actually in an advantageous position. I got about 4/5 of the way through Rodrigo's paper unscathed, and then got me a little bit, so we'll see. But the paper probably in some places feels a bit tedious, other places fast and loose, not tedious enough. Anyway, no more apologies, let me start. So, new title, Philosophical and/or Poetic Nationalism Toward the Foreign. In Derrida's work, the word or mark Geschlecht is at once the locus of a certain critical deconstructive suspicion and an object of fascination, to say nothing of a spurred intellectual productivity to writing and thinking. To reiterate what is no doubt familiar to anyone attending this conference, Geschlecht means sex or gender, but also race, in the semantic field that this approximates that of kind or genre in English, but it also means generation, descent, lineage, or stock, adding a supplementary semantic determination related to race, but not quite reducible to it. This provisionally untranslatable polysemic complexity in turn provides a certain supplementary performative force or value to the word. Geschlecht means sex, gender, race, descent, stock, lineage, and the fact that it means all these things signifies in turn a certain untranslatable Germanness, poéticité allemande, Derrida might say, that then felicitously rebounds back upon and thus reinforces at least one of its proper senses, that is, Geschlecht as race or perhaps lineage. At the same time, pursuing the etymological descent of Geschlecht qua word, an a fortiori word belonging to a language, brings us to the Schlag, the blow or stroke or coup, and this brings us very close as well to the thematics of marking and inscription, thematics that in turn trouble precisely just such an account of the unity of the word and its belonging to a language. As if in bracketing Geschlecht as the Schlag that it is, it no longer appears simply as a word defined by a semantic unity, no matter how complex, but is now some other kind of thing, a mark, a bit of writing, what might be called a signifier, were it not for the implication that signifiers signify. In spite of everything, Geschlecht does not simply belong to a language. Even from this quick sketch, one can see that Geschlecht, whatever it is the site of a conflictual negotiation between discourses of essence and origin and those of repetition and inscription, with difference wobbling in the balance, flickering between differences of identity and difference from identity, if not différence with an A. Of course, Derrida does not come to Geschlecht as such, or by himself, but rather through its deployment in the texts of Heidegger, and above all through Georg Trakhl's poetry as read by Heidegger. Posing Geschlecht alongside the initial mention of these two proper names, Heidegger and Trakhl, already hints at the unusual condensation of problems in the Geschlecht series, and above all in Geschlecht III. Geschlecht names a political problem, call it race or kind or sex, but it also signals the framing of this political problem as a philological, literary, or poetic one. Philosophy is thus doubly bordered here by the poetical and the political, and the peculiar character of this double bordering that will largely concern us in what follows. Geschlecht III is presented by Derrida within the frame of his 1984-1985 seminar on philosophical nationalism. At least as far as Geschlecht III and Heidegger and Trakhl go, philosophical nationalism will turn out to imply a or perhaps even require a detour by way of poetry. Though, seen from the other side, starting from Heidegger's text rather than from Derrida's seminar, one could just as well say that opening up thinking, denken, to poetizing, dichten, turns out to be a way of doing politics by other means. The Philosophical Nationalism seminar and the Geschlecht series name two of the most obvious frames of reference or context for Geschlecht III. One could also name Derrida's earlier writings on Heidegger, particularly Usia and Gramé, when it comes to the question of Heidegger's relation to Christianity and various tropes of fallenness and Verfallenheit, renarrated in the ambiguous Schlaggeschichte of the Charcoal essay. Similarly, the basic formulation of the Philosophical Nationalism seminar recalls Derrida's earliest work on Husserl and the Introduction to the Origins of Geometry, in which writing qua material ideality is the condition of possibility and impossibility of the freedom constitutive of philosophy. This is very closely aligned to the problem of the idiom as the scandal and opportunity of philosophy, the scandal and chance of philosophy in the nationalism writings. Nonetheless, for reasons that I cannot fully explain, but which I hope become somewhat clear as I proceed, I'd like to draw attention to another frame or conversation that pertains especially to this double bordering of philosophy, philosophical triangulation of the political and poetic. I'm referring to the trajectory of the writings of Derrida and Nancy, together and separately, from the literary absolute to the retreat of the political by way of the inoperative community. I mean this in several interrelated ways. The literary absolute, it seems to me, combats a tendency to idealize the literary as the way out of the impasses of metaphysics. In doing so, it also historicizes a certain version of deconstruction, precisely by showing the impossibility of historicizing romanticism. In their schema, the Romantics define literature in terms of its allegedly superior power of effectivity or Wirklichkeit, so that literature is born as a political supplement to philosophy. Derrida's gesture in relation to Heidegger and Jacques thus seems broadly analogous to that of and Nancy in relation to Schlegel, that of a critical repetition of an ostensible precursor text, taking aim at the specifically political implication of the philosophical appropriation of the literary. Similarly, the very concept of philosophical nationalism resonates with the program of the Center for Philosophical Research on the Political, founded by Derrida and Nancy with support of Derrida in precisely this period. With this introduction in place, let us now turn to the text in question. In the final paragraph of the first session of the 1984-85 Philosophical Nationalism Seminar, published as Ontotheology of National Humanism, Prolegomena to a Hypothesis, Derrida writes the following. One can denounce, suspect, devalorize, combat philosophical nationalism only by taking the risk of reducing or effacing linguistic difference or the force of the idiom, thus in making that metaphysico-technical gesture which consists in instrumentalizing language. But is there a language which is purely non-instrumental, making it a medium which is neutral, indifferent, and external to the philosophical act of thought? Is there a thought of the idiom that escapes this alternative? That is one of our questions. It does not belong to the past, but is a question of the future. And here I am not just talking about the future of this seminar. Even bearing in mind the relatively inelegant, informal writing that marks the genre of the seminar, the chain of thought is slightly awkward or puzzling. The first utterance, save the parenthetical self-interruption, is categorical, unequivocal, thetic, as if relaying the knowledge won in the course of a demonstration. One can denounce, suspect, devalorize, combat philosophical nationalism only, I underscore only, by taking the risk of reducing or effacing linguistic difference or the force of the idiom, thus in making that metaphysico-technical gesture which consists in instrumentalizing language, making it a medium which is neutral, indifferent, and external to the philosophical act of thought. Derrida alludes here to a slippage or short circuit between the difference that eludes generalizing subsumption or relation and what we might term identitarian difference in a nationalist mode. The sentence that follows hardly seems to follow, almost as if pronounced by another voice. Imagine an interloper in a Socratic dialogue. Is there a thought of the idiom that escapes this alternative? The alternative named is, to be clear, philosophical nationalism, or the effacement of the idiom in a technicist metaphysics of communication. Having just formulated what seems to be a general law, Derrida immediately seeks or seems to seek that which escapes this law. Does his emphatic only thus not hold? Yes and no. What if another thought of the idiom may also entail doing something other than denouncing, suspecting, devalorizing, combating philosophical nationalism? What if, in other words, one outcome of this initial session is not simply the law qua alternative that Derrida somewhat reluctantly or melancholically formulates, technicist metaphysics of communication, or nationalist communitarian cultivation of the untranslatable idiom, but the awareness that this binary law itself flows from the impulse to denounce and suspect. And as a consequence, that one might do well to break up this oppositional chain, denouncing, suspecting, devalorizing, combating philosophical nationalism, and to combat or devalorize philosophical nationalism by means other than those of denunciation or suspicion. This is not, so to speak, to denounce denunciation, but to formalize the economy within which it operates. By the time we get to Geschlecht III, that is later in the same seminar, we can grasp a fairly clear alternation between more and less denunciatory tonalities, between more and less denunciatory versions of deconstruction. The intervention of a poetic text may also have something to do with this alternation of tones, to cite Hölderlin's famous phrase. In fairness to Derrida, the combating or denunciation of specifically philosophical nationalism already entails a kind of deconstruction of the political, finding the political other than where it usually resides and in a different modality, which is to say in the margins of the philosophical text, and taking a teleological or projective form rather than an empirical or indeed a biological one. Nonetheless, it's fair to say, I think, that the version of deconstruction on display here, that is initially in the philosophical nationalism seminar, if we grant the use of this shorthand, has a more than usual affinity for the denunciatory or the suspicious. So I'm in some tension with Rodrigo's argument. I think we end up maybe in a similar place. In any case, everything takes place as if the outcome of the first session were an unpleasant surprise, as if Derrida had accidentally maneuvered himself into a trap or dead end, in which the alternative to the thing he would seem to be denouncing is as perfidious or ignominious as the thing he is denouncing. The point is not just the predictable one of thinking around oppositionality, nor just a certain distancing from this more denunciatory mode of deconstruction, but the conceptual dead end to which it seems to lead, namely the renunciation of the idiom as a seemingly necessary byproduct of the combat against the worst. All of this is to say that deconstruction itself, with its characteristic emphasis on difference, idiom, untranslatability, is at stake in the seminar on philosophical nationalism, and this is all the more the case by the time Derrida gets to Heidegger, who provides, if I might put it this way, the example of philosophical nationalism that is closest to deconstruction. Now we'll get into actually Geschlecht III itself. Derrida's reading of the first line of Jacques, cited by Heidegger in the opening sentence of the first full section of Die Sprache im Gedicht, is exemplary for the larger argument on philosophical nationalism and idiom. Heidegger begins with the line, Es ist die Seele ein Fremdes auf Erden, from the poem Frühling der Seele. In Krell's rendition, something strange is the soul on earth. Even before beginning any detailed interpretive work on this passage, its relevance to our topic is immediately clear, as the line concatenates the question of metaphysical dualism, Seele, Erde, and therefore not just philosophy, but the deconstruction of metaphysics, with that of the foreign or strange, ein Fremdes, and therefore, by differential implication, the national or the proper. Thus, not merely philosophical nationalism, but philosophical nationalism at the point where it touches Derrida's own project most closely. Heidegger thus deconstructs the apparent dualism of the Chaco poem by way of a counterintuitive or unexpected understanding of das Fremde. On the obvious or doxic dualistic reading, the strangeness of the soul on earth would reside in a kind of fall of the soul or spirit into matter, a calamitous collapse of a proper duality, the violation of a metaphysically authorized vertical hierarchical relation. Heidegger begins his contestation of this reading by inquiring into ein Fremdes. But what is called fremd? Under the type of the foreign, one ordinarily understands the not familiar, that which does not appeal, something that instead encumbers and disturbs. However, fremd, Old High German fram, really means onward to elsewhere, underway, after, toward what the future holds. Das Fremde wanders ahead, but it does not err, devoid of any purpose or determination, hopelessly lost. Das Fremde goes seeking the place where it can remain a wanderer. Almost veiled to itself, Fremdes already follows the call along the way to its proper. According to a procedure we might think of as a kind of philological, phenomenological desedimentation, the authentic or proper meaning, eigentliche Bedeutung, of Fremd is that of its root or etymological ancestor, the Old High German fram, as if the word just were another word, or even as if the two words were actually one. Contemporary German word secretly bearing within itself a determining diachronic of memory or historical recollection that all but usurps it, even as the contemporary word persists on the surface, barely covering over this diachronic profundity. Movement would seem to prevail, the word moves from its place, takes semantic flight, and its new but also very old sense is precisely that of movement, of towardsness or wandering. The fixation of nominalization from fremd to ein fremdes turns out to fix precisely a directionality of movement, a prepositionality, onwards to elsewhere. The grammatico-semantic tension between nominal fixation and prepositional directionality is then transformed into an explicit thematic affirmation. Das Fremde goes seeking the place where it can remain a wanderer. Das Fremde geht suchend auf den Ort zu, wo es als ein Wanderndes bleiben kann. Das Fremde is also ein Wanderndes, that or who remains wandering after arriving at its place qua goal, and takes this remaining wandering as its goal. Remaining wandering is the proper of the foreign, sein eigenes. Everything in Derrida's reading hinges upon this question of the propriety of the foreign, particularly as it is rooted through the problem of eigentliche Bedeutung, the authentic or proper meaning of fremd. But before we get to this question, which will lead us to philosophical nationalism as such, it is important to see how the foreign operates in Heidegger's account of Jacques' deconstruction of dualism. Proceeding a bit brutally, I realize now I'm channeling Derrida here when I say that, Heidegger positions the Erde as the goal of Bestimmung of this foreign, fremd, from soul. What seems like a catastrophic fall from transcendence is in fact a paradoxical imminent salvation. In Heidegger's language, wandering the earth amounts to saving the earth as the earth, rather than transcending it or sublating it according to the usual salvific models. Though Derrida refers to this as a kind of reversal of Platonism, tout commence par une sorte de renversement du platonisme, it is crucial to note that the gesture does not lead us from idealism to any mere empiricism or naturalism in the modus of a mere reversal. The gesture is much closer to the non-privative affirmation of finitude, Endlichkeit, that is one of the fundamental motifs of being in time. Just as temporality is not a deficient eternity, earth is not a deficient heaven or ideal sphere, remaining wandering is thus imagined as the authentic or proper existential mode that corresponds to or affirms earthliness and temporality. The question remains as to whether this saving the earth, as the earth necessarily flips back over into authenticity or Uneigentlichkeit to the very degree that it understands the earth as something that can be saved, gerettet. Right? But I want to make sure we understand Heidegger's gestures. I think Derrida's a bit speedy there. The next step, Heidegger can thus claim the sentence, something strange is the soul on earth, names instead the essence of what is called soul. The sentence contains no statement about the soul as something already known in its essence, as if in the form of an addition that would merely need to be noted that the soul had suffered the unfitting and the strange accident of finding neither refuge nor response on earth. On the contrary, the soul is, as a fundamental trait of its essence, something strange on this earth. So the soul is constitutively foreign or foreign and fremdes, rather than contingently suffering this fate as a wound to its essence. As ever in Heidegger, we should hear Wesen as both noun and verb, essence that is by definition exposed to time, temporalized essence, Wesen wanders. I was going to say Wesen wanders. Right. We should note too the slight hesitation in the determination of temporal essence, which cannot proceed just as the metaphysical determination does. Thus the line of poetry names the essence of what is called soul. Not only that, it is not a matter of an accidental or secondary attribute added to a transparently knowable essence, die im Wesen schon bekannte Seele, but the Grundzug of this Fremdfram, wandering, inscribes a certain indetermination, called Zeitlichkeit, in the very determination of essence. So if Heidegger's version of deconstruction, or destruction, destruction, or Abbau, unbuilding, takes place along the lines of a deconstruction of an apparent metaphysical dualism, Derrida's deconstruction, be it more affirmative or more suspicious, will engage the apparently foreign Fremdes that is the agent or operator of Heidegger's reading. Here, then, is the first step of Derrida's reading of the Fremd, which is so determining for everything that follows. What thread will we follow in this apparently labyrinthine trajectory? To begin with, that of the word stranger, which, appearing in the first verse cited, sets the first step in motion. Es ist die Seele ein Fremdes auf Erden. Once again, the decision comes back to Old High German, which keeps the authentic signification of this word, fremd. Before even getting to this decision, note the paradox. In regard to the question of knowing the meaning of foreign, or rather, fremd, because any translation appears to be a priori illegitimate, the response remains idiomatic. It belongs to only one language, to a certain state of the language. The nomination of the foreign, or rather of fremd, is so proper to such an idiom that the stranger qua stranger would not know how to accede to it or access it. What one calls translation, in the current sense, never crosses this frontier. We will not cease to see the workings of what one would call in Germany Unheimlichkeit of this situation. Here Derrida roots out philosophical nationalism where one least expects it, in Heidegger's seeming celebration of the foreign, perhaps not unlike the manner in which Heidegger locates an overturning of Platonism in that which initially sounds like the most predictable and regressive Platonic metaphysics. Derrida works in two steps here. The definition of fremd is idiomatic and thus untranslatable, belonging not merely to German as such, but to a certain state of the language, un certain état de la langue. This definition, ce que veut dire étranger, ou plutôt fremd, contains with it an ostensibly untranslatable term that thus radically arrests the infinite universalizing movement associated with definition. There's a very strong relation with definition and the renvoi. Every definition could go on ad infinitum. So the fixing the definition of the one word in an untranslatable signifier actually goes against the logic of definition and the renvoi structure associated with it. In a second step, Derrida plays the ostensible untranslatability or non-translation of from against its ordinary sense. La nomination de l'étranger est plutôt de fremd et si propriété idiome que l'étranger ne saurait y accéder en tant qu'étranger. The foreigner is excluded from understanding what the foreign is. And only the properly German understands what the foreign is. Or more precisely, only the German who understands that fremd is from, who understands the certain état de la langue, is really properly German. That is, philosophically or transcendentally German. As Derrida points out, the exclusion of any Latin-made synonym, like for instance the French étranger, on which Derrida relies, is effectively double. Not only is the foreign word excluded, but so is the etymological reference to a border crossing, the X that is retained in a transformed manner in étranger. From retains no such reference to border crossing, and instead only traverses the virtual space of German's own archaeological profundity. Performative is at issue in two distinct modes. Heidegger thematizes the foreign, but does not translate, does not, so to speak, gesture towards the impossible translation. Doing and saying are thus in some tension with one another. This mixing of philosophical conceptualities, Heidegger and Austin, concern and performativity, each of which provides resources for undoing the reign of metaphysical truth as adequatio, is itself a gesture of heretical translation, a somewhat mischievous resistance to philosophical nationalism. And sort of a footnote here. Interestingly, this juxtaposition is a theme in Derrida's Wellick lectures on Paul de Man, delivered in spring of 1984. The originally announced topic for these lectures, altered after the death of de Man, was more overtly relevant to the question of philosophical nationalism, deconstruction in America. So I think we can see the traces both of the Wellick lectures on de Man and their original topic, deconstruction in America, and the way in which Austin and Heidegger interact within the context of the seminar on philosophical nationalism. Second, perhaps more profound sense of performativity, made explicit by Derrida toward the end of Geschlecht III, but already implicit here, is the community-constituting dimension of the cut that divides fremd from both its foreign language equivalents and its ordinary German definition and usage. This is of the order of a call or promise. Crucially, the promise therefore projected or promised into Crucially, the community, therefore, projected or promised into being, is thus divided on two sides. Divided from other nationalities in the manner of traditional or vulgar nationalism, but also divided from a vulgar German nationalism. One can thus grasp the special affinity between the performative and the philosophical teleological nationalism, inasmuch as vulgar nationalism would appear to be aligned with the merely given, i.e. that which is seemingly susceptible of unproblematic constitutive affirmation. More pointedly still, philosophical nationalism finds a peculiar ally in the poetic, which qua projective poiesis is unbound by constitutivity. It is somewhat surprising, but perhaps also revealing that Derrida takes recourse to the notion of Unheimlichkeit here, arguably the paradigmatic German intransmissible, et ce qu'on appelle traduction au sens courant ne passe jamais sur cette frontière, nous ne cesserons de voir à l'œuvre ce qu'on pourrait appeler en allemand le Unheimlichkeit de cette situation. For if Derrida's for if Derrida's argument is that Fremd for Heidegger is only ever pseudo-foreign, this reduction of strangeness would seem to be quite distinct from, if not opposed to, any account of the strangeness of the home or proper. That is, unless there is a hint of reversibility in Derrida's argument, up to this point unacknowledged. If there is a cut between the Fremd from of an authentic philosophical nation to come, and the banal misunderstood Fremd of everyday speech, or is tempted to say of das Mann, then German appears as foreign to itself and thus unheimlich, at least to the vulgar German who thought he now knew German, but now feels the ground give way beneath his feet. From this point of view, this experience of linguistic befuddlement may precisely begin the passage from vulgar to philosophical nationalism. And to the degree that this passage is itself aligned with the uncanny, the condition of possibility of any return to propriety or semantic reappropriation is the forgetting of this uncanny passage. Paradoxically enough, this means that the very passage from one form of nationalism to another bears the potentiality to undo identitarian thought. So this very movement shows that German is not identical to itself. So for nationalism to hold up, one has to forget the passage from one form of German to another. Further, we might say that Heidegger betrays his own thought to the degree that this passage from improper to proper sense, even from Uneigentlichkeit to Eigentlichkeit, comes to resemble a cut or break. According to Heidegger's own earlier thinking, the structure of Eigentlichkeit, whose only content resides in Uneigentlichkeit, is nothing if not uncanny, unheimlich. Any propriety that forgets its own uncanniness, that returns home to unsere Sprache, is improper, uneigentlich. So in other words, by making a cut between the proper and the improper, Heidegger is actually betraying his own conception of Eigentlichkeit and Eigentlichkeit as being irreducibly structurally bound up with one another, at least as articulated in Science. So Heidegger's essay repeats this etymological poetic desedimentation throughout this procedure we saw with Fremd and From, does with leise, Wahnsinn, jener, still, and indeed Derrida will seize upon many of these examples. For now, Fremd and Derrida's analysis of it will have to stand in for the whole series. Next section of the paper. In session 12, that is very near to the end of the trajectory of Geschlecht III, Derrida, again, in a mode that is both reflective and somewhat defensive, insists on the relevance of Heidegger's reading of Jacques to the question of philosophical nationalism. A very long quote here. Sorry. What I ask myself all the time in doing this is the following. Where would one find, and does one ever find, in another language, in another national philosophical tradition, a philosopher who is also a big university philosophy professor, who proceeds in this way, treating language in this manner, entering into a Gespräch with a roughly contemporary poet and poems belonging to his own national language? If it exists in French, one would have to see it's in a completely different style, and I think you would find Heidegger's traces or footsteps there, if not the Heideggerian model. These are my own very rough translations. I hope this is somewhat adequate. Since posing these questions, proceeding to imaginary variations, in this way testing the idiomaticity of the Heideggerian gesture is to bring out national difference, and in fact, practically, through this practice, to treat the question of nationalism. Why is what Heidegger did never done in a different language, in a different national tradition? Where does this come from? What's this about? To sharpen these questions, one must really add that Heidegger does not think here only as a philosopher, but beyond philosophy, questioning precisely philosophy. One must also add that this interrogation is not content just to cite a poet or to invoke poetic testimony. At the same time, it defines or supposes the definition of the Gespräch, of an essential Zwiesprache between the thinker and the poet, each of them arguing at the same heights, if one can say so, two peaks, about the essence of Sprache, untranslatable word. This Gespräch, its possibility, its definition, its expectation, its situation, are absolutely impossible, ignored, forbidden, or rejected everywhere else, everywhere outside of Germany, and perhaps even within all of Germany today. Reading these lines, it is impossible not to think of Derrida's own example, to think, in other words, that Derrida is questioning the relation of his own practice of reading poetry to the Heideggerian procedure, with its specifically poetic version of philosophical nationalism. En français, s'il y en a en français, il faut prévoir, c'est dans un tout autre style, et je crois qu'on y relèverait une trace du passage de Heidegger, sinon du modèle heideggerien. On the face of it, the statement is contradictory, if not confused. In a completely different style, but one can find there Heidegger's trace or footsteps, if not the Heideggerian model. Though one could quickly add the paradoxical description fits or rings true for Derrida's own practice. A completely different style, yet one marked by Heidegger's footsteps. In some sense, we're back to where we started, with the question of the denunciation of philosophical nationalism, in distinction from some other, perhaps more effective, yet more intimate, more effective because more intimate, way of countering philosophical nationalism. And if Derrida writes that Heidegger's text speaks of itself and speaking of the other, Rodrigo touched on this, one cannot but wonder about a similar dynamics when Derrida writes Heidegger. If Derrida's claim is that the opening of Denken to Dichtung is compromised from the very beginning by its determination as Gespräch or Zwiesprache, a capturing of this opening or would-be otherness within the restricted dynamism of a national language, the question is how to repeat the model differently, how to radicalize this opening. As Derrida would be the first to argue, the structural problem goes far deeper than philosophical nationalism, in the sense in which any dialogue is overdetermined by the manner in which one partner, at any given moment at least, establishes the terms of that dialogue, leading to an irreducible, if not necessarily static, asymmetry. Here, paradigmatically, Denken determines or overdetermines Dichtung. The poem is a philosophium. At the same time, the irreducible violence of the very co-positing of terms is the condition of possibility for thought to encounter something other than itself, to undergo alteration by way of reading or being read. There is no question, then, of a pure or true dialogue, pure openness to alterity. The determination of this quasi-dialogue through and as unsere Sprache in a mode of national linguistic exceptionalism shuts down this problem far too quickly before its abyssal or infinite character is acknowledged, before formulating a strategy that registers the shape of the problem. To put this slightly differently and to formalize it through a late Derridian idiom, to which Jeff Bennington in particular has drawn attention, any Gespräch worthy of the name, digne du nom, would have to be open to the possibility of becoming something other than Gespräch. What would a Gespräch look or sound like that frees itself from philosophical nationalism, that does not root linguistic dynamism and self-difference back into semantic reappropriation and identitarian community? Is such a thing, rigorously speaking, possible? Or does the communitarian short-circuiting of the untranslatable idiom remain an irreducible possibility? Though Derrida writes of imaginary variations, one need only turn, or so is my claim, to a lecture Derrida gave at the very same moment as the Philosophical Nationalism seminar, a lecture that might count as peculiar extramural supplement, hors de série, so to speak, to the seminar translated beyond its own walls. Namely, this is a lecture that would become Shibboleth for Paul Celan, originally delivered at the International Paul Celan Symposium in October 1984, presumably just before the beginning of the 1984-85 academic year in France, in which the Philosophical Nationalism seminar was given that seems to conclude Geschlecht III. In spite of Derrida's well-known resistance to the thematic of community, even in the limit form of Communauté des Ouvriers, Shibboleth too turns on the question of the community constituting poetic word. The term shibboleth occurs in two of Celan's poems, one entitled Shibboleth from the 1955 collection From Schwelle zu Schwelle, From Threshold to Threshold, the second entitled In Eins, In One, or As One, from the 1963 collection Niemandsrose. Before getting to Celan's various shibboleths, we should recall, as does Derrida, the peculiar sense, status, and history of the word shibboleth, if it is one, to cite Derrida. Shibboleth, this word I have called Hebrew, is found, as you know, in a whole family of languages, Phoenician, Judeo-Aramaic, Syriac. It is traversed by a multiplicity of meanings, river, stream, ear of grain, olive twig, but beyond these meanings it has acquired the value of a password. It was used during or after war at the crossing of a border under watch. The meaning of the word was less important than the way in which it was pronounced. The relation to the meaning or to the thing was suspended, neutralized, bracketed. The opposite, one might say, of a phenomenological epoche, which preserves above all the meaning. The Ephraimites had been defeated by the army of Jephthah in order to keep their soldiers from escaping across the river. Shibboleth also means river, of course, but that is not necessarily the reason it was chosen. Each person was required to say Shibboleth. Now the Ephraimites were known for their inability to pronounce correctly the sh from Shibboleth. They said Sibboleth, and at the invisible border between sh and s, betrayed themselves to the sentinel at the risk of their life. They betrayed their difference by showing themselves indifferent to the diacritical difference between sh and s. They marked themselves with their inability to remark marked, thus coded. Perhaps you even see with a certain horror or dismay where I'm going. What is the relation between Heidegger's version of philosophical nationalism and the structure of the Shibboleth? Is Heidegger or Haeckel's fremd from, or any other of his etymologized dictorish words, a kind of Shibboleth? If not, what exactly is the difference? After all, of the community constituting performatives identified by Derrida and Geschlecht III, one can also say quite precisely that they, quote, acquire the value of so many passwords. Just as the philosophical nationalist is separated from the vulgar one by hearing the archaeoteleological sense of words in the place of their ordinary sense, the Gileadites distinguish themselves from the Ephraimites on the basis of their own capacity to say Shibboleth rather than Sibboleth. It would be reckless, not to say invidious or ignominious on the face of things, to compare, let alone to equate, Heidegger's philosophical nationalism, the phantasmatic resuscitation of the humiliated empire only very recently and very partially denazified, with any bit of Jewish culture or lore, and again, a fortiori with its appropriation by a Jewish poet writing in the aftermath of the Shoah or Holocaust. With this caution thus in place, let's take a slight detour through the Shibboleth story itself before coming to Derrida's interest in it, Celan's appropriation of it, and Derrida's reading of its appropriation. The Shibboleth story does not lend itself to easy moralizing or political identification. It tells the story of a conflict between two tribes of Israel, the Gileadites and the Ephraimites, after the Ephraimites, not recognizing the Gileadite Jephthah as their legitimate leader, have failed to aid the Gileadites in their struggle against the Ammonite invaders. It is a story of apostasy in the judge's narrative, that is, of the failure of the tribes of Israel to live up to their own chosenness, their messianic vocation, with the seeming triviality of the diacritical difference figuring as the index of the shamefulness of this internecine conflict. According to judges, the minimal phonemic difference leads to the deaths of 46,000 Ephraimites. At this point, it is useful to provisionally distinguish Derrida's interest in the word or mark or quasi-verbal thing, Shibboleth, from the story out of which this emerges, even though it will eventually have to bring story and mark back together. For the paradox of Shibboleth is that its very non-self-identity as a word, the fact that it splits from itself in its graphic phonetic materiality and that its meaning is rigorously bracketed, becomes the grounds for an identitarian exclusion, the distinction of Ephraimite from Gileadite. Shibboleth is perhaps not so different from Geschlecht in this sense. Probably also worth noting that Shibboleth, Sibboleth, graphic identity and phonetic difference is the mirror image of différence, phonetic identity and graphic difference. And no doubt différence can function as a kind of Shibboleth, just as Shibboleth might come to exemplify or remark différence. But running ahead of ourselves slightly, we might ask to what extent the mark Shibboleth, rather than functioning as the basis of an identitarian cut, might instead promise a different form of community, one capable of persisting in non-self-identity. In other words, the tension between the decontextualized mark Shibboleth and the narrative in which it is embedded, the index of a tragic propensity towards the reassertion of identity, or is there some other path to be found or forged here? At this level, the comparison with Heidegger's fremd from and the other quasi-shibboleths of philosophical poetic nationalism is instructive. In both cases, the word comes to differ from itself. Fremd is split from itself and becomes fremd from. Shibboleth is divided into shibboleth and sibboleth, and the splitting of the word acquires an additional communitarian performative function. Let us now attend to the difference pole of the analogy. In Heidegger's case, the word calls forth another word that it hides or bears within itself in a kind of synchronic diachrony, in immanent history. The word hides another word within as a memory. In this sense, Heidegger's community-constituting performative rests on hermeneutic operation, a sublation or Aufhebung with a moment of self-difference. The word moves outside of itself only to return to itself in a different form, die eigentliche Bedeutung des Fremdes. Rather than a simple opposition between the hermeneutic and the performative, we have their intertwining. Those who get the archaeological meaning are called together into a community in a manner that promises a further teleological or messianic fulfillment of that meaning in a philosophical poetic community. In the model of shibboleth, the hermeneutic is bracketed rigorously. Rather than diverting the word into an archaeological depth where it can be recovered, the epoche of shibboleth discloses that it is no longer one word at all, indeed no longer a word at all, and thus cannot simply belong to any natural or national or communitarian language. We return to a similar version of the problem we faced earlier with the Unheimlichkeit of German. Does this cut or break amount to a difference internal to one word or one language that ultimately suspends or undoes these unities, those of word and language, or does it simply divide one word and one language into two words and two languages and thus immediately restitute unity? The comparison is perhaps complicated by the specificity of modern notions of nation and national language, even as modern nationalism, or all the more so philosophical nationalism, often imply a messianism that recalls the story of Jewish election. In other words, anachrony everywhere and in both directions. So, on one hand, violence executed through a hermeneutic detour or peregrination. On the other hand, violence exerted quasi-immediately at the level of cultural corporeal competence, bypassing semantics and fundamentally grounded in the disunity of the word. To repeat our earlier question, what would a community look like that takes into itself the structure of the shibboleth itself, qua non-word, rather than taking this non-word as the ground for identitarian difference? At this point, in moving toward the conclusion of the paper, we should turn toward Ceylon's specific appropriation of shibboleth and Derrida's reading of it. The poem in question is called In Eins, in one or as one. Though there is no time to go into detail here, those of us who have had the privilege of reading Geschlecht III may recall the emphatic schwergeschriebenes Ein Geschlecht, through and as which the two of sexual difference passes over from a warlike agonistic Zwietracht, strife, into a tender Zwiefalt. As with Gespräch, the question is to what degree the national linguistic motif subsumes this two-ness, so a question of the subsuming Ein Geschlecht. In any case, Derrida insists that this in eins describes a multiple singularity rather than any unproblematic unity. In the supplementary preposition, we might recall something of the grand logique of deconstruction that Derrida somewhat ironically lays out in Geschlecht III. Every gathering presupposes and is grounded in a prior dispersion to which it ultimately attests reluctantly or otherwise. The in of in eins marks this play of dispersion and gathering, as if to insist that some dispersion persists within this gathering, or conversely that some gathering is necessary. And that's the quasi-genitive je. It's translated into English as some. It's a kind of indeterminate quantum. To leap into a reading of the first strophe of In Eins, here the word shibboleth is not simply reversed in its functioning from an operator of exclusion to one of inclusion. As we'll see, it instead enters into a series of motifs which, collectively and sequentially, come to signify a certain exclusion of exclusion itself in a kind of popular front of anti-fascist translation. Thus the first stanza of the poem. In eins, 13. Februar, im Herzmund erwachte Shibboleth mit dir, Puppelibachie, no passaran. As one, 13th of February, in the heart's mouth, and awakened Shibboleth with you, Puppelibachie, no passaran. According to what is probably the most famous argument in the text, Derrida aligns shibboleth with the figure of the date, and more specifically the dated poem. Like a date, like 13. Februar, shibboleth is a cipher that cannot be deciphered. These two ciphers come not only to figure one another, but to figure the poem as such in its irreducible secrecy. The date has a referent in multiple associations, but it also refers to its own future repetition, to that which will be drawn into its associative orbit. One referent of the date seems to be the funeral of the victims of the 1962 Sharon Metro massacre, but the date as such is inexhaustible. So that's 1962, February 13th, 1962. In Eins is published in 1963. But it is not this argument that really interests me here. As alluded to a moment ago, shibboleth is drawn into another series, the words shibboleth, pertaining not so much to the secrecy of the poem as to resistance, the formation of a front against fascism, the closing of the border to fascism, no passaran. That's Spanish Civil War slogan. Reading Shibboleth back through the question of philosophical poetic nationalism, Celan's double gesture suddenly becomes clear. One border is opened, the border between German and Spanish, or between Hebrew and Spanish, just as another is closed off, that between fascism and anti-fascism. No Pasaran translates and transvaluates Shibboleth. The mode of translation is not that of idealizing substitution, but of a material adjacency, as if the poem included its own translation or face. The intervening lines, mit dir, peuple de Paris, add a few further multilingual blocks to this front. Where Heidegger's fremd from promises the foreign, but represses the Latinate X of, for instance, l'étranger, and thus implies no border crossing, precisely as it does not itself cross the border into any Latinate translations or etymology, here the thematization of non-passage, no pasaran, immediately betrays, ironates, and complicates itself with the performance of translation, the passage across linguistic borders. Though I have worked to bring out the question of philosophical poetic nationalism in Shibboleth, one does not have to work very hard to find it elsewhere than in the text. Derrida cites in passing a quotation from Marina Tsvetseva that Celan places at the epigraph to the poem mit dem Buch aus Tarusa, all poets are Jews. And Derrida goes on to write, seemingly in his own voice, all those who deal with or inhabit language as poets are Jews, but in a tropic sense. And the one who says this, consequently, speaking as a poet and according to a trope, never presents himself literally as a Jew. As we can see, the distance of this form of philosophical poetic nationalism from that of Heidegger is not so far, given that a certain play or metaphoricity is the very condition of possibility for the movement from vulgar or literalist nationalism to a more refined philosophical nationalism. Derrida reads this utterance as an instance of abyssal self-reflection. All poets are Jews is itself a poetic, which is to say a tropological or figurative utterance. Identity is infinitely and abyssally punctured by metaphoricity, and Jewish, perhaps in its diasporic sense of nation without nation, is one name or figure for this perpetual puncturing. Recuperation, one thinks of the semantic reappropriation of the fremd in Heidegger, is a perpetual risk, and Derrida will talk about this. The permanent metaphoricity of the diasporic Jew is separated by a very thin line upon which everything seems to rest, from the pseudo-errancy of the wandering Teuton, the wandering German. To be Jewish would also mean to be open to being something other than Jewish, for instance, Palestinian, to being translated, with remainder, for sure, into other names. In our historical conjuncture, the risks and chances of such a strategy are evident. Using Judaism to protest Zionism may serve to prop up the Jewish exceptionalism at the core of Zionist ideology. No equivalence, then, between Heidegger and Derrida, or between Heidegger and Celan. Still not sure what to do with Jacques himself, but permanent vigilance in the construction and deconstruction of community or nation, philosophical, poetic, or otherwise.
Thanks so much, Dan. I'd like to open the floor.
Thank you so much for a rich and multi-layered talk. I just have a tiny question on the relation.
Tiny questions are the dangerous ones.
Yes, and it refers to translation, relating the proper and the strange in Heidegger.
Yeah.
Maybe you could. There's one of the first translations. I only stumbled on that.
Heidegger or do you want Derrida?
The Heidegger one.
Yeah. He's a. Do you want this one or this one? Doch was heißt fremd?
This one.
Yeah.
I only stumbled on that because of the English translation,
Yeah.
and it's just a question to understand better the relation between the stranger and the proper.
Yeah.
Because here in the in the final lines it says, das Fremde geht suchend auf den Ort zu, wo es als ein Wanderndes bleiben kann.
Yeah.
And then in the English translation, it omits the als, and it says, you have that on the next slide, where it can remain a wanderer.
Not as a wanderer, yeah.
Not as a wanderer. And
Yeah,
I was just, yes. No, but it's just interesting because if this, because in one of the next lines, Heidegger says, he speaks about the call and den Ruf, and Derrida quotes that. He says, das Fremde folgt dem Ruf auf den Weg in sein eigenes.
Yeah.
So it moves towards its proper.
Yeah.
Now the interesting thing is, does in this place where it reaches its proper, does it remain wandering or not?
Yeah.
And I think that is in the Als-Struktur.
Yeah.
Either it remains as wandering, or as wandering, it finally finds its proper, and then it sort of stops wandering or stops being a wandering.
I think what I was trying to get at is this nominalizing fixation of wandering makes wandering itself a kind of telos. I mean,
Right, okay.
So the proper is to be a wanderer.
Right.
But the key point is that one wanders without crossing a border, which is why one can both wander and be in one's proper element at the same time.
Okay.
The exclusion of the X, as it were. But I mean, the tricky thing is that, as it were, I mean, Eigentlichkeit, or the eigen or proper Eigentlich, reasserts itself at the level, it belongs to two series. It belongs to the Bedeutung meaning series, so to speak, and the stranger and the home foreign series. You see what I mean? And that's the sort of that's the key to Derrida's reading, is that as soon as Fremdis becomes a problem of Eigentliche Bedeutung, it betrays itself immediately, unless one rigorously applies some kind of uncanny understanding of the proper as itself improper.
Just a small addition, since we talk about translation.
Yeah.
Can you go to the passage in French that begins with since? This is a small thing, but it's been bugging me all through the paper. Since in French, you have it translated as since.
Yeah, dès lors.
Voilà.
Yeah, what?
It's just dès lors, I think it's therefore.
Yeah.
Not since, right?
Okay. Oh, okay.
Dès lors. Or henceforth.
Henceforth, thank you.
Yes.
These were done very quickly.
This is very small,
Yeah.
but it's been in my head. So.
Okay.
Sam and then Peter.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. I'm sort of mildly scooped, but very excited by the reading you're providing. And it just sort of occurred to me, and I really like the move to the Paul Celan essay. I was wondering and I'm looking at the Geschlecht, when you had it earlier, you don't have to put anything up. It was very interesting when Derrida is summarizing the kind of move he's attributing to Heidegger with the question of German and foreign and the German. And then I was just sort of wondering whether this invention of another idiom that he's looking for that would neither be techno-metaphysical or nationalistic is as simple as the single sentence he has when he just says to his French-speaking audience, his students, the Unheimlichkeit. Like, the only way I can say this is the only way I could describe what's happening is to use the German word here, and he's saying it in French.
Yeah.
And in one sense, to me, that's it.
Yeah.
Because you could imagine if Heidegger, if in the passage in Heidegger said, well, the only way I could really explain what Trakel means here is to go to French.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a French word for foreigner.
Yeah.
Suddenly we'd be out of, it's sort of the positioning of the speaker and the language.
Yeah.
That's the move of untranslatability.
Yeah.
I mean, is it that simple?
I think I'm supposed
I mean,
to
it's
say
complicated. Well, it's very complicated what that
I
unpacks.
mean,
but
the first version of this paper was originally about translation, and I think I didn't write that because it seems to me that's the question that Derrida is, I think, for essential reasons. I don't want to say repressing, but it's lurking there. He says several times, translation in the current sense will not allow this, which implies that what we call translation is much more complicated than that. In the first, I took out a section of this. So in the first, in the Onto Prolegomena to National Humanism hypothesis text, he makes this move where he actually interprets translation itself through Heidegger's notion of care, and says that we're always already engaged in the problem of translation and of the making these choices, so that translation can never simply become a thematic object, and we can't really know what translation is. So he's basically saying, listen to what someone says about translation, sure, but also watch how they translate. So there would be another way of doing this that would watch Derrida's own practice of translation rather than the translation decisions he makes. I think and this goes back also to some things he says in what is a relevant translation in this notion of word-to-word economy. I mean, I think in one sense, translation simply is pedagogy, and this I think also goes to what David Crow was saying at the beginning, that there is, once we have infinite time, we can translate I don't want to say adequately, but I mean that there is, how can I say this? I'm going to get myself in trouble here, because No, I don't want to say that, but I'll say it this way. What I will say is that these moments where Derrida formalizes his argument to a great extent, these kind of hyper-pedagogical moments seem to be marshaled as a counter-gesture to the Heideggerian emphasis on the idiom and the untranslatable, to which Derrida is also very attracted. It does not seem to me there is a question of any solution here. It seems to be an issue of multiplying gestures, that one has to actually be hyper-pedagogical, hyper-formalistic, and attend to the untranslatable idiom. I also think, last thing I'll say about this, is that the Ceylon poem is itself multilingual, right? I mean, that's the thing that's hardest to translate. That's the real untranslatable. It's the thing that's itself. And I think Derrida is saying that's, in a way, that's actually the rule and not the exception. But we don't know. We don't see language that way because we're caught within this sort of national linguistic ontology. So I think the whole framework of what's a language, of what a translation is, has to first go through the question of what a language is, a national language is, units, etc. I think Hamacher has written on these kinds of questions very persuasively. Long-winded answer, sorry.
Yeah. Now we all are referring to these PowerPoint things. Could I see the Celan poem No Pasaran?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say that Feber
Yeah.
is of course not a German
Yeah, it's dialect, yeah.
word. Yeah, it's Austrian.
Ah, well, yeah.
So
Yeah. So we're back to Krakow.
my daughter, 8-year daughter, wouldn't understand this
Yeah.
word. She would not think that this is February.
So maybe I should have stayed Februar in the English, just the way No Pasaran and Punto del Perfect.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that of course, one could ask why is Celan doing that? He uses these Austriacisms also in Tübingen, Jänner, for instance. He used the word Jänner for January. So I guess there is a performative dimension in this poem, also referring to shibboleth. But this is actually not what I want to refer to. The thing is that we have here in a way a poetical dimension. You are linking or connecting with the political right up from the beginning. And we say with Heidegger that this kind of poetical production of shibboleth is something what, well, in a way can be a fascistic figure of thought or a fascistic figure of politics. But I just want to try to turn it to make it different, or to go a different path, and ask you, what do you think about that? That this kind of connecting politics with poetics, what Heidegger actually does, and you said that before, is something that, claims a hidden origin, a hidden source of Germanness in poetry, very far away from what we call folk, or what we call the Germans.
Yeah.
So in the sense, you can say, okay, Heidegger and other Germans, they have this strategy to build a community on a hidden source.
Yeah.
But in the other way, couldn't we turn it around to say, if Heidegger and others are claiming these kind of absent origin, and they are always shifting this absent origin more away from the normal Germans, it's actually a destruction of a political community. It's a dissolution, because what Heidegger says actually is that the core of Germanness is a unreachable origin. And this is something what you can actually not use, or I ask you, how could we use that in the political dimension, on the field of political theory? So it's just I'm not sure myself.
Yeah.
But we think that this is the strategy to found a people on a hidden origin. But on the other hand, in the other way, is what also, for instance, on the performative level of poetry works here in Celan also, is that poetry is not actually giving a present fundament for a people, but if you want to say, well, maybe an absent or whatever, but this is in the political dimension. It's or we can say it like that. It's not. Maybe it's not. It's not very successful. But I don't know. This is the point. I just want to ask. Well, how you connect these levels?
Yeah, I have about 10 things to say in response, and I'll try only to say 2 of them or 3 of them quickly. It's a really hard and interesting question. I mean, there's a whole history in Germany, in particular, of projects, and I'm sure you know far better than I do, of recuperating Germany by having some kind of secret or esoteric Germany, poetic Germany that's preferable to the empirical. I think there might be different moments at which one could go for that strategy or find it sympathetic. I think here, trying to recuperate kind of us as Deutsch, kind of andere Deutschheit, no. So I get that some kind of empirical Germanness, some kind of origin is being displaced, but something else, another myth comes to replace it immediately. So on that level, no, if that's a yes or no question. But then several things follow. I would say I haven't read the whole philosophical nationalism seminar series. It's not published. I do wonder about whether philosophical nationalism is sort of a problem as such, right? If you think of anti-colonial philosophical nationalism, for instance, would be the easiest, right? Or just simply whether it's inseparable from, I mean, you go back to Enlightenment, Kant had a debate, all of this stuff. One could imagine a cosmopolitan community of philosophical nationalism so that these things don't oppose each other. One needs to cultivate national philosophical idioms in order to cultivate, I mean, there would be a way of complicating that argument. I don't know where Derrida goes with that. There's, Deleuze has investment in a certain concept of geophilosophy, or it's recent Italian difference anthology trying to recuperate a kind of non-nationalist conception of the Italian specificity of philosophy. I'm not for or against, I'm just saying there's people who are trying to recuperate traditions of philosophical nationalism. Third and last point, then I'll shut up. Just to make really clear what my point is, to me the issue has to do with nomination and where a name intervenes that is supposed to stand in for something non-identitarian, and how any name that does that is constitutively open to recuperation, no matter what name it is. So no name transcends that fundamental structural problem. So, I'll say one last thing. This is a really important question. I would also say there's a little bit of a double bind that I was struggling with between, let's say, trying to think about the way different names operate, what connotations they have, what histories they're embedded in at different historical moments, and the iterability of names that means they can be disembedded, constitutively open to this disembedding. So, and that's, obviously the question of what Jew means now versus what it means for Heidegger and how it's afflicted from the very beginning and can be put. It's great to say, nation without nation, diasporic people, but it can also be used to motivate the most severe nationalism and Zionism and exclusion, right? And on one hand, it's a question of conjuncture, but the conjuncture is constitutively open. It's never full. So I want to be historically sensitive, but also realize the limits of that historicism, too. Okay.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add a footnote to this, which is, to me, the absolute strangest moment of Geschlecht III is right on this part, because it's where Derrida interrupts his narrative voice and addresses the people in the seminar, and he says twice. He says, "I dare you." He says, in answer to your question, the names, and this goes to what you were just saying, the names Hölderlin and Trakel gather a poetic tradition to a notion of a German folk, whether or not it's an esoteric one, and that's sort of the point you were just making. And he said there's an absolute link between that gesture and Germanness. It could only be German, and that is because of the place that poetic tradition has within the German tradition, so Hölderlin and Trakel are that. But then he says, and he says it twice, he kind of stops the seminar, and he talks directly to the people, and he says, I dare you. You quoted one of them, but not the other one. Come up with an example of another philosopher working with the philosophical tradition, talking to a poet who's his contemporary, and unlike Jacques Derrida and Francis Ponge, right? Like, for example, Jacques Derrida and Francis Ponge. And he does it twice, and he actually sort of says, come on, And this is a performative moment. It's having to do with what you were saying about performance. He says, tell me, I dare you, speak, stop the seminar. And I just didn't know what
I had
to
the exact
do
same
with that
thought, yeah.
moment because it's an actual performative address
Yeah.
where he's interrupting himself in the seminar and asking something, and the answer is obvious. It's like, you dude,
Yeah.
you know, and you dude, even with the reference to the Heideggerian traces.
Yeah.
And so it's as if he's sort of saying, he's provoking you, Daniel, come at me, you know, write this paper.
Yeah.
But he actually wants an interruption.
Yeah.
And it's the only break in his voice in the whole seminar.
Yeah. Could I just say shortly something about? I'm pretty sure that this Hölderlin, for instance, lecture course in Heidegger have also a performative dimension. Namely, that really he speaks to the people in the room, and he wants to produce this community in the room. So the question I was actually posing is how much eccentricity eccentricity, yeah. How much eccentricity is possible for the political dimension? Because we know that the Nazis in 33 or 34 actually thought that Heidegger is weird, that Heidegger is crazy.
Yeah.
By claiming Hölderlin as the Bible for the German people. So on the one hand, I'm pretty sure, and I really would criticize him and would say no, that it's indeed a political move. He has to really to be the founder of a new Germanness.
Yeah.
But on the other side, we cannot ignore that these moves of Heidegger were actually in a way more destructive than we think, and therefore the Nazis really thought that he is more dangerous to say the real Germany is the secret Germany of Stefan George. Nobody would Hitler would have said the man is we cannot work with that. That's something what is even dangerous in a way. So there are these both elements, and sometimes I'm not so sure. I'm criticizing Heidegger, and I would criticize it, and would go on criticizing it, and also Derrida in this point. But on the other side, we have to be aware of this in a way that no normal German would ever quote Secret Germany from Stefan George to say what he thinks is German. But well, I don't. I don't want to apologize, of course not, Heidegger. So that's I just want to say that again. But maybe I will say something about that tomorrow also in my paper.
Wonderful. Well, I really hate to interrupt conversation. Instead, I'll say let's continue it over lunch. Everyone is invited to come to the lunch that's being served next door. And let's thank Daniel once again for